Hey, what's going on everyone? This is Swyte. As you can see, we are on the Terraria forums right now looking at melee weapons balance changes. So for anyone who doesn't know what the changes to vanilla items have been, this is what this video is for. I will be covering the melee weapons and the ranged weapons. It'll probably be a little bit of a long video, since I'm not just reading them off. I'm also going to be giving an opinion of whether it is good or not, but yeah. And then I'm going to make a second video on the mage and summoner weapons. So let's just get right into it, since I don't want to make this video too long, even though I think it'll end up fairly bulky anyways, but let's just try our best not to make that happen. First up, we have short swords. You guys probably know what the short swords do, since they were kind of widely featured by Relogic. They can be used in all directions, not just forward, and the damage was increased by 1 for the gold short sword. Probably to balance the gold short sword with the platinum one more equally, since the platinum one does 13 damage, I think. So I still don't think that short swords will be that useful. They're just too limited in what they do, because there's nothing else to them but the little stab. And even if you can directionally use it, it's still not that great, but it is not useless anymore, in my opinion. The flails got completely changed. You can swing them around, you can use them just as you did before, but faster, and you can make it drop and kind of act like a spiky ball. And it's 3 completely different functions of the flail, and I think that is very unique. And I think it's probably going to be fairly viable in the game as well. I don't think that flails are going to be complete garbage anymore. Next, we have the Cactus Sword, which got nerfed. The damage was decreased from 9 to 8, use time increased by 7 points, and the knockback was decreased by 0.5 points. And the reason that I believe that they nerfed the Cactus Sword was because that it was better than the wooden swords that you could get at the time. It was probably better than a decent amount of weapons that you could get at the very beginning of the game, and the Cactus Sword is extremely simple to get. You just have to go to the desert, cut down a few cactuses, and then you have a Cactus Sword. And it's a pretty big upgrade to whatever you're going to have at that point. So that is why they made such a substantial nerf to such a early game and fairly weak weapon overall. But it's just that little area in the early game where you just get that big power boost with the Cactus Sword that caused it to be a little too strong, I suppose. The next buff is the Trident. The damage was increased from 11 to 14. The knockback was increased by 1, and when you hold it, it gives you unrestricted movement in the water. So I think that the Trident, it wasn't really useful for anything much except for early game clearing hordes of monsters, and I think that's still mostly what's going to be used for. It's going to be decent. It's going to be even better at what it already did because it has an extra 3 damage. But I think that it's actually going to shine because of the unrestricted movement in water, which is not something that you can really get with anything else, I don't think, until Neptune Shell. I'm not positive about that, but I can't think of any other things that give you unrestricted movement in the water off the top of my head. Maybe one of the diving gears or a potion, but I don't know, there's not much. So I think that the Trident is going to be helpful in that regard. It's helpful in the oceans when you can get it, and I think that it's also going to be decent underground, because there's so many of those times when there's just the underwater water spots that just get you, and you're like, oh, because this is so annoying, I can't jump high enough, or I'm too slow, I can't run away from these 5 piranhas chasing after me. And the Trident will help you with that, so I think it's a good item to just have in your hand for that purpose alone, honestly. The Chain Knife got its damage increased by 1. I don't think it'll do that much for the Chain Knife. It just has a little more damage output. I think it's a decent weapon already if you can actually get it early. I think it's dropped by cave bats, right? So yeah, I think it's decent, but nothing special. This buff just gives it a little more damage, but I still don't think it's going to be that much better than it already is. And that is perfectly fine with me. Next up, we have the nerf to the Enchanted Sword. It's got its damage decreased by 1, use time increased by 3, and the knockback decreased by 1. So they just gave it an overall nerf to stats, and that's probably because that if you find an Enchanted Sword right at the beginning of the game, it's just really, really strong and solid. And while it might not be the strongest boss killer weapon, it is extremely solid in anywhere that you need to clear out normal monsters. So I can agree with the nerf. It is probably a little too strong, especially since you can get it literally right out the gate if you go across your overworld and find one of the shrines and you actually get an enchanted sword from it. So The Falcon Blade was nerfed. The Falcon Blade is the sword that you can get from fishing. The damage was decreased by 5, and the use time was increased by 5, yeah. I don't know why I'm stopping to think about that. It's literally right there. I never thought of the Falcon Blade as extremely strong, but that's probably because that I never got it super early in the game. It is really strong if you could just fish for it and really just get it right off the bat, but I think that it quickly gets outclassed because it is just a fairly fast swinging, high damage pre-Hardmode sword, but it doesn't have anything else to it. It doesn't have any projectile, it doesn't have anything special, and I think that because of that, it's not an exceptional weapon in pre-Hardmode, but right at the beginning of pre-Hardmode, it is probably a little bit OP, so I can understand why they would nerf it. The Lightsbane got a size increase from, or size scale increase from 1.1 to 1.4. I don't think that's really going to do much for Lightsbane at all. I think it's still a pretty mediocre weapon at best, but it'll make it a little bit better at zoning, controlling monsters, and just keeping them away from you, so I suppose that it has some use. The Amazon got nerfed. The damage was decreased from 20 to 18, and the stingers and jungle spores required to make it were both increased by a huge amount. Stingers by 6 times and jungle spores by 3 times. And I think the reason for this nerf is because you can just go down into the jungle right at the beginning of the game. That's the reason for a lot of these nerfs, I think, I'm noticing. And just by getting some stingers and jungle spores and then like 1 or 2 vines, I think, you can make the Amazon, and then it's a really solid pre-Hardmode Yo-Yo. The Beekeeper also got nerfed. I never thought the Beekeeper was a super extremely powerful weapon, but I can see why they did it. They took away its auto swing, which I'm sad about, but I mean, there's not a lot of auto swing swords in pre-Hardmode, so they decreased the knockback by 0.3 to increase the use time by 2 and decrease the damage by 2, so just general stat nerfs. Muramasa got buffed. The damage was increased from 19 to 21, and I think this is a decent buff because Muramasa swings really fast. So even with just 2 points, it will stack up to a fair DPS boost. So nothing incredible, but Muramasa is already, I think, decently usable for stalling and just dealing with enemies very easily that are on the ground. So I think that the damage will just make it a little more viable in those situations. The Fiery Greatsword, the use time was decreased from 34 to 30, so you can use it a little faster. 30 use time is still quite slow. It's not auto swing, so I think that the Fire Greatsword is still going to be pretty bad. The Breaker Blade also got buffed. The damage was increased from 39 to 43, so just a little bit of damage. Use time was decreased by 1 point. I don't know why it was 1 point, but I guess that was a change that they felt was needed. And it gained a mechanic where it deals 2 times damage to enemies with over 90% HP. I think that the Breaker Blade is going to be pretty decent right after you beat the Wall of Flesh, because for Wraiths and the hard mode mobs in the Corruption and Crimson, stuff in the Hallowed, I think that the 2 times damage especially, so I think the Breaker Blade will actually be decent, although it's going to fall off quick and it is not helpful against bosses. It looks like all the hard mode or swords were buffed. They were just so weak, I guess. The Palladium Sword, the damage was increased by 4, Mithril Sword by 5, Orichalcum Sword by 3, and the use time was decreased. The Adamantite Sword, use time was decreased, and damage was increased by 6. Titanium Sword, damage increased by 6, and the use time decreased by 1. So the hard mode or swords, I don't think they're still going to be that great. They're just plain swords. They do nothing else. It's just a true melee weapon, and I don't think that's that good, especially because like the damage increases aren't massive. They're pretty small, so they're a little more viable. You can use them if you want. I think that they're going to work okay for mobs at the beginning of hard mode, but they're still not going to be affected that much. Phase Sabers, the damage was increased by 41 to 42, and the use time was decreased from 25 to 20. So Phase Sabers have never been that great. I don't think they'll still be that good, because again, they're just a true melee weapon, kind of like the hard mode or swords, and I don't think that true melee weapons in general are that phenomenal. Next up, we have the Beam Sword. The use time is increased from 15 to 20. I'm not actually that sure what the beam sword does. I don't know if I've ever used the beam sword. Let me look this up. I don't know, the beam sword doesn't seem that amazing. It's just good if you get it early hard mode because it's dropped from armored skeletons or something. So I get why they would increase the use time, just a general damage nerf, because it is, I guess, very powerful if you do get it, but it is quite rare. I don't know if I've ever really gotten one on a vanilla playthrough. So, I don't know, it's just like, there's not that many situations where this nerf would come into play, but it is there for those situations, I suppose, so there you have it. The fetid bagnacks, that's what I'm going to call them, I have no clue how that's supposed to be pronounced. They got nerfed, the damage was decreased from 70 to 60, the use time increased from 7 to 8, and it only gains 25% the benefit from increased melee speed stats. So that is a large nerf. I feel like they were only useful for a couple of different bosses. Maybe I could be wrong though? Overall damage decreased, and the speed that you can use them was massively decreased, because they only get a fourth of any increased melee speed stats that you have. So yeah, the damage is going to be lessened. They're probably still going to be okay. You don't have to build them with a ton of attack speed, and they still have 8 use time, so that's quite good. The anchor, the damage was increased from 30 to 55, and the use time was decreased from 30 to 20. I mean, the anchor is an atrocious weapon. Or was anyways. So they gave it a huge buff, actually. So maybe it'll be useful. It'll be okay if you can get it in the early hard mode, as a lot of these weapons are. I don't know if it'll be anything incredible, though. Probably won't be, but who knows? We'll just have to see. The Format C, damage was increased from 29 to 35. The Gradient, these are all yo-yos as well, I believe. The damage was increased from 34 to 44. The Chick damage was decreased by 1. Amarok damage increased by 4. Hellfire damage increased by 4. So, they're just making most yo-yos a little bit better. Probably just to compete with other melee weapons. Let's move on. We have Excalibur. The damage was increased from 57 to 66. The use time was decreased by 20%. Again, if I'm doing my maths correctly. So, that'll make Excalibur better. Excalibur, it's a true melee weapon, so I don't think that this will be amazing. I wouldn't really use Excalibur regardless, to be honest, but I think that if you do want to use it, you can. Just for taking out normal monsters and groups of monsters, I think the Excalibur is a pretty good weapon for that. The Brand of the Inferno was buffed. The damage increased by, is that 41? Alright, well that's a huge buff. Brand of the Inferno is the sword that you can guard with that drops from the Ogre, I think? Was it really that bad as far as damage went? I guess it must have been, because they really, I mean, they gave it almost 2 times the damage that it had, and that is a massive buff for pretty much anything. I don't know how useful it'll be, because I don't think I've actually used the Brand of the Inferno, but we will have to see. Sleepy Octopod does 3 times damage, up from 2 times, or it has a smash attack, and that's what does the extra damage. And I'm not sure about that either, because I don't think I've used the Sleepy Octopod either, so I'm not sure how viable that'll be, but that is the buff to it. The Cog 2, another yo-yo, damage increased from 47 to 54, so again, another stronger yo-yo. The Chlorophyte Claymore got buffed, the damage was increased by 5, so decent buff. I think that this is to balance it, because I think the Chlorophyte Saber does do better than it in general, so they just probably did that in order to balance the 2 swords out, or to try to anyways. True Knight's Edge, the damage was increased from 90 to 105, and that's a 15 damage buff. That's a large buff to the damage, and I think that's going to make True Knight's Edge pretty good for when you get it. And you can always I think you can just turn into a Terrorblade right away if you have True Excalibur, so you probably wouldn't use it that much, but if you don't have True Excalibur, then the True Knight's Edge is probably a pretty good weapon to be using, because it does have a decent projectile, and it does good true melee weapon damage as well. The Psycho Knife got reworked and buffed. The functionality overhaul renders this weapon akin to an upgraded fetid bagnax. It maintains its stealth bonus. The damage increased from 70 to 85, so 15 more damage. The use time was decreased to 8, and it only gains 33% benefit from increased melee speed stats. So it gains more benefit than the fetid bagnax. It has the same attack speed. I think the fetid was increased from 7 to 8. And the damage of that was 60, and this is 85, so yeah, that's pretty big. That is a pretty big buff. Key brand, the damage was increased from 70 to 85. Now deals up to 150 extra damage based on how injured an enemy is. So a big buff to Key brand. Key brand was just a true melee weapon, I think. It doesn't have anything special before. So that's pretty significant. You can just get it in the dungeon after Plantera. I don't think it's anything special, but it'll definitely be usable, because, I mean, a 15 damage buff from 70 is pretty big. So, yeah, I think that's going to be... Key brand is going to be an okay weapon now. The Kraken, the damage was increased by 5. It has a 10% crit chance. Do most Yoyos have a crit chance? Or do they not have a crit chance? Did this one not have a crit chance? That's weird. Anyways, Kraken is just another Yoyo. It's going to be better. Yeah. That's about all I have to say about Yoyos, honestly. The Scourge of the Corruptor got buffed. The average projectile spawn from each shot increased from 2.3 to 2.66. And I think that means that it's more likely to shoot out 3 than 2, as before it was more likely to shoot out 2 than 3. I think that's what those numbers would mean in this case, so the projectiles are just better. I really like the Scourge of the Corruptor as a weapon, to be honest, so it's a nice buff. Bounces it a little bit more with Vampire Knives as well, because those are still stupid strong. The Golem Fist was increased by 14 damage, so better weapon. Still going to be fairly because you do have to like hit the fist. Doesn't have any other special abilities, so I think it's going to be okay though. The Christmas Tree Sword was reworked, and I've seen this. Instead of firing one ornament, it fires several ornaments and a star ornament that will hover in place for a few seconds before falling to the ground. And it's now auto swing. So it wasn't auto swing before. A hard mode sword that's not auto swing. That's kind of trash, in my opinion. But I think that this is a strong rework. I mean, auto swing already is good. And then the projectiles make it seem like it's going to be more useful for situations where you're not moving around a lot, where you can stay still. And the last thing on the melee weapons buffs and nerfs is a quote-unquote buff for the Daybreak. So it's a bug fix, but it makes Daybreak better. So it would not spread its debuff if you killed the target in one hit. Now it spreads the debuff to nearby enemies, even if the attack kills the target in one hit. Okay, so a little Daybreak buff just caused by a bug fix that they had to implement. And that is all of the melee weapons. There's all the changes for them. Sorry if, like, this is, like, a very choppy video. My narration is really bad, honestly. My brain does not go well with my mouth, so... Oh well, though. Moving on to ranged weapons. First up, we have the Bone Javelin. It was moved to an earlier tier / nerfed. Converted from thrown to ranged. Damage decreased from 29 to 20 due to earlier tier. Earlier tier. So does that mean that you can get the fossils earlier? I assume that's what it means. I don't know what else it would mean. And then... as well, the thrown weapons are ranged now, so there's not a thrown damage class anymore. They're all ranged. In pre-hard mode, you will be able to upgrade to like necro armor and still be able to use these weapons if you feel like. And who knows, some of them may even be very good. We'll just have to see for that. The Bee's Knees got nerfed. The damage was decreased by 3. The use time was increased by 1. So it's just generally worse. And I think that's a fair buff because the Bee's Knees is a really strong weapon. It just shoots a line of bees that do the damage of the bow, which is already decent, at like 26. And then they split into bees that just keep damaging enemies. So it's like Bee Nades. It's similar to what Bee Nades do. It's just a little bit worse than Bee Nades, I think, because Bee Nades do better overall, but it's still really strong. So I think this nerf is fine. Next up, we have the handgun, which is buffed. The use time was decreased from 12 to 10, so you can just use it faster. The handgun's a decent weapon. Okay, that's alright. The Hellwing Bow was increased damage by 2. The use time was decreased by 1. Knockback increased by 0.5. So just better in general. I think the Hellwing Bow is okay. I do like that it's buffed. It shoots pretty quickly, it shoots inaccurately, but against some bosses, and I mean like the Wall of Flesh, like it's perfectly fine against that. And it's fine in open spaces where there's a lot of enemies. So the Hellwing Bow is going to be a little bit better. It's not really going to change the viability though. We have a nerf to the Clockwork Assault Rifle, which is just a really strong weapon. It shoots 3 bullets for every 1 bullet. You can just get it from the wall of flesh, so that's a lot of damage. And it shoots fast too, so yeah. The damage was decreased by 2. Little nerf, I think that's fair. It'll just be balanced, still be strong. All of the aura repeaters, where their use time were all decreased by 1. So make aura repeaters a little bit better. I don't think it'll do that much to their viability, but I mean, you can make them if you want now and see if there's a difference. The marrow, the damage was increased from 40 to 50. So the marrow was, I think, a decent bow already. Drops from skeletons, armored skeletons most likely. So it just does a fair bit of damage. I still think the marrow is like a really basic bow. It doesn't have anything special to it, and it's just 1 arrow. So I, like a lot of the weapons, I don't think that it'll be massively changed, but it'll be better. It's gonna be better. If you like the marrow, use it more, because it's better now. The ice bow was buffed. The damage decreased from 46 to 39. The use time was decreased from 21 to 16, and it now auto fires. Okay, so the ice bow damage was reduced, but it now shoots quicker and it auto fires. So that's interesting. Well, first of all, a bow that doesn't auto fire in hard mode, yikes. This might actually be a decent bow, because, I mean, 16 use time is pretty dang fast. Auto firing is good. There's probably still going to be stronger bows at the point you can get it, but if you do get it, I think it's going to be decent. Moving on, oh, here's a big one. The nerf to the Daedalus Stormbow. The damage was decreased from 43 to 38, and when using holy, unholy, hellfire, or jester arrows, it shoots an average of 2.66 arrows instead of the normal average of 3.33. It shoots less arrows and the damage is reduced. I think it's still going to be good. It is still going to be powerful, especially if you don't use one of these 4 arrow types. I think the Destroyer Daedalus Stormbow will still be one of the best weapons to kill him with. Probably the same thing with Duke Fishron as well. Yeah, that remains to be seen, but Daedalus Stormbow, big nerf, and that is well deserved, because the Daedalus Stormbow is one of the most stupid broken weapons in the game, or was at any rate. And next up we have the Dart Pistol, increased damage by 5. The Dart Rifle, increased damage by 10. So, it's weird, like the dart guns, they don't use normal ammo, they use darts. I've never really used them, so I can't really say how good they'll be, but they're better now. So those are the dart weapon buffs. I've never used a Toxic Harp either. The use time was decreased from 14 to 10. So it's pretty fast use time. I don't know what it actually does though, so I won't be able to tell you guys about that. But yeah, that's a little bit stronger. The Hallowed Repeater, the damage was increased by 10, and the damage was increased by 10, and the use time was decreased by 3. So the Hallowed Repeater is probably going to be decent now. I mean, that's a good damage buff, and as well a use time decrease. And I think this is to balance it with the Glorified Shot Bow, which also got nerfed down here, as you can see. So yeah, I think these will probably still be perfectly viable. Flamethrowers got buffed, or yeah, just normal flamethrower, not all the flamethrowers. Damage was increased from 27 to 35, and it applies a 15% damage penalty to the next hit for each enemy a projectile pierces. So basically, it's stronger against single targets, and the more targets that you're hitting, it's going to be weaker. It'll probably still be good for clearing out moderate numbers of monsters, and it's going to be better against bosses and stuff, so yeah, I don't know how good it'll be against bosses. I would like to try it though, for sure. Phantom Phoenix, the damage was increased from 24 times 2 to 32 times 2, that's because it shoots 2 arrows. The use time was decreased by 2, so it shoots faster, and the Phoenix projectile now fires on every 3rd shot instead of every 4th shot. I think it's still pretty inaccurate as a weapon, so it's going to be weird to use regardless of these buffs, but it is, like, these stats all are pretty big in general, so big DPS buff. I think you're still gonna have to use it in certain situations only, because it is an inaccurate bow, and bows that are inaccurate can't be used in any like tight spaces, hard to use against certain bosses, so yeah. But Phantom Phoenix probably be easier to use. Glorified Shot Bow was nerfed. The arrows per shot decreased from 2.7 to 2.33, so it shoots arrows less, or it shoots more amounts of arrows less, I guess. It's weird to say, but the Glorified Shot Bow is really strong, because you could just go to the jungle and get it right after beating the mech bosses, and it shoots multiple arrows, which seems to be just a really powerful thing, kind of like the Daedalus Stormbow. I wonder if the Glorified Shotbow will be like more on par with the Daedalus Stormbow now. The Venus Magnum, the damage is increased by 12, and that is good, because I think the Venus Magnum is just kind of like the Mini Shark in terms of power overall, but it's worse. So it's good they buffed it, since this is like a post-Plantera thing. The Grenade Launcher was buffed, use time was decreased by 10. Grenade Launcher is just awkward to use in general. I don't think it's about how fast you shoot it. I think it's just an awkward weapon, so I don't think that this buff will do that much. But I mean, if you do like to use a Grenade Launcher, this is a very large attack speed buff, so it'll do a lot more damage. Rocket Launcher, the damage was decreased from 50 to 45. It does 2 times damage on direct hits to a single target. So the overall damage was decreased, but it'll do more damage if you're fighting one enemy. So probably going to be used for bosses, I would think. I don't know how good it's going to be against bosses, but I mean, if it's doing 2 times damage on direct hits to a single target, then you're going to be using it on bosses. I think that a lot of bosses will be susceptible to the rocket launcher now, because again, the damage is already decent and 2 times damage is very significant. So I think using this to take down bosses will be a viable thing to do. We have a rework and buff for the proximity mine launcher. Does 3 times damage when mines are stationary, normal damage when they are still moving. The use time was increased from 40 to 50 and reduces the number of active mines that you can have at once. That's weird, because there's 2 nerfs in there. You can't use it as quickly, and it reduces the number of mines that you can have at once. But it does 3 times damage only when mines are stationary. I don't know when the proximity mine launcher is useful in the first place, though, to be honest, so yeah, I guess it's better. I just don't know when or how exactly. So yeah, someone can tell me in the comments how that makes it better, what situations you could use it in. Now we have the Piranha gun. It shoots out 3 piranhas, which can attack the same or different targets. The rate at which the piranhas can bite has been decreased slightly on an individual basis, but the total DPS of the 3 piranhas is much higher. Cool rework, I like that. The Piranha gun is one of the most underwhelming of the elemental chest weapons. Or it's not elemental, I don't even know what I would call it. It's the special chest in the dungeon. I can see this being a pretty good weapon now. Now we have the Pulse Bow, which is buffed. The damage was increased by 20. The use time was decreased by 2. The damage reduction for each target hit increased from 10% to 20%. So it has a big damage increase, a little bit faster use time, and the more enemies you hit with it, the less damage the bolt will do. And I mean, that was already how it was, but now the effect builds up quicker. So I think that the Pulse Bow is gonna be a fair bit stronger, because 20 damage is really good. It's a really good buff. The Stinger was buffed. It does 2 times damage on direct hits to a single target. Only applies to the initial bolt, not the fragments. So the Stinger buff might make the Stinger actually usable. I think it's going to be the same as the rocket launcher. It could be used on some bosses, strong single target monsters like, I don't know, paladins. We're gonna have to see how good the Stinger is in comparison to other things, but 2 times damage, again, is a very strong ability for a weapon to have, so I can see it being good. The Celebration was moved to an earlier tier. They moved a Moonlord drop to an earlier tier, and it got nerfed. The damage decreased from 65 to 25. Okay, I can see why that is, because I mean, it's a Moonlord weapon turned into a non-Moonlord weapon. Note, rocket damage is very high and is added to this. Even rocket 1 second deal 40, so the actual damage reduction is 105 to 65, even using the worst rockets. Okay. And bonus critical chance of 10% removed, and it is now sold by the party girl after Golem. So you can get this after Golem. I don't know how useful that this itself will be, so yeah. And we have our last 2 right now. The Elf Melter first is buffed. The damage was increased from 40 to 60, so a 20 damage buff, and applies the same damage penalty as the normal flamethrower did. So the Elf Melter is going to be the same deal. Better for less targets. Probably pretty good for single targets. I still don't know how it'll be in comparison to like guns, but I mean, being used for bosses will be a well, you'll be able to use it much better against bosses for sure, because it got a 50% damage buff. That's huge. Anyways, moving on, we have the SDMG, which was buffed. The damage was increased from 77 to 85, and the chance not to consume ammo increased from 50 to 66. I don't know why they buffed the SDMG. I think that it was already the strongest gun in the game. Like, was it actually being contested by the Vortex Beater? Because if it was being contested by the Vortex Beater, considering that it's a post-Moonlord weapon, I can see why they buff it, but I think that the SDMG was considered a better gun. But regardless of that, I mean, it's a substantial damage increase. You don't consume much ammo, and I mean, we all know the SDMG shoots super fast. So yeah, it'll be better. I mean, it is a post-Moonlord weapon, so I'm not sure. Really, like, the buffs and nerfs don't really do much after post-Moonlord, except for mods, because that's where post-Moonlord content is available. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for an SDMG buff, honestly. I'm just gonna be right out there. Ranger class is my favorite class in the game, so hey, I'm all for a nice, hefty SDMG buff. And that'll be all for this video, guys. I hope that you did enjoy somewhat, even though my commentary is freaking terrible. I stumble over my words so much, but it's alright. It is alright. Also, my throat is, like, shot right now. Like, my voice is going to die. I can already tell. Hope that you guys learned something. Give me your thoughts on some of these buffs in the comments below. I want to see what you guys think, especially for some of the ones that I just don't know what impact they would really have. So yeah, for sure, let me know. But that will conclude this first video of the balance changes, and I'll see you all in the next one.